let's talk about assessments. Let me define that first of all. So assessments are the processes we use to determine a student's strengths, weakness, and how it affects their learning and their learning process. Underneath that, we find the two types of assessments, which are formal and informal. Formal being your standardized tests, your state testing, the data that we get from those formal tests. Usually we use to compare one body to another body or one student to another student. The second type of testing is the informal testing or informal assessment, which is non-standardized, and it's what we use in everyday classrooms. It's what we use to create different instructional methods, and it's done by a lot of observance. Next, we need to understand that there are types of data that come from these assessments, and then they are formative and they are summative. Formative data comes from a formative assessment, which means that this test or this assessment is given in order to help us formulate judgments on the students. And a lot of the formative assessments are what drive instruction, or what drive the different methods we use with each student. Then you have your summative, which is also equally important, but it's just what it says in the beginning of its word. It's the summary, the end. It's all the data that we collect at the end of everything we have taught. And this also drives instruction, but it's more so used for a planning method, and from my experience. So what does this all mean? Why do I need to know about assessments? Well, we need to know about assessments so we can figure out whether we as instructors, as educators, as interventionists, whether we need to remediate or we need to intervene. So remediation, that is the reteach, that is the revisit, that is when we as educators look at what we have taught, take an assessment, look at that data, and see whether or not our students are grasping the concepts or not. If they aren't, okay, let's go back and revisit the topic. If they are, okay, we can move on. Now, remediation is done as a group. So, if I give my students an assessment, or if I am observing that there are several students that are not grasping a concept, I'm going to want to remediate with them. I'm going to want to pull them aside and say, hey, let's revisit this. Or if it's a whole class, I might need to say, hey, we're going to spend extra time on this specific concept. That is remediation. Then we have intervention, which is a lot of where we have more assessing, of course, but it's an individualized type of assessment. And interventions are where we come in as educators and as interventionists to look at a specific student's needs. Why isn't this student grasping this concept? Why is this student performing at this level? That is an intervention piece. So the difference is the group versus the individual. How do we get to these concepts? How do we get to decide whether or not something is remediative and whether or not something needs to be intervened with? Well, we have assessments for that. With assessments, of course, as I said before, we gather data. We gather a lot of data from assessments. And in specific, we usually look first at a diagnostic test. If we're looking for interventions, we're going to want to look at a diagnostic test or diagnostic assessment. Those are standardized. They are usually given by a specific person who is trained in giving the diagnostic test. And what that does is it will determine your strengths and your weaknesses of your student based on specific areas. And it will also tell us where their phonics skills are, where their any type of skills they have, what range they are in. It'll cover through subtests these specific skills. What it will also do is it will identify the student's reading level. It may also identify or compare how this student measures up against another student, which can help us determine grouping or determine other specific interventions we can provide. But most importantly, diagnostic tests will give us a student's weakness. The next type of test that we want to look at, especially in the reading department, will be a reading and literacy assessment. And those are often your Ames-Webb testing, your DIBELS testing, a STAR test. And what those do is they test specific reading skills. So if I want to dive deep as a reading teacher, I would want to give a reading or literacy assessment, because that will tell me my phonemic awareness. It'll tell me my word identification. It'll tell me my vocabulary. And that list just goes on and on and on of what specific reading skills I need to have data on. Then lastly, let's say that these skills, the data is not there, and hey, maybe I need to look at their language development. Then we would perform or actually give a language assessment. And what this does is it measures the language development of a child. How well do they speak? How well do they read? How well do they interpret? And one of the most famous tests for that would be the AZELA here in Arizona, which is given in February, and it's standardized usually. So it looks and compares the student to other students, but it's also very individualized. So those are the types of assessments that we can give in order to figure out, hey, do I need to remediate or am I needing to intervene? And finally, once we've figured out which interventions or which remediations we need to give to our students, we have to monitor their progress through progress monitoring. That means keeping a running log, keeping a portfolio, keeping all the data that we have collected over time, and comparing that and looking at it and seeing how has my student progressed, has my student regressed, or do I need to move on from something? These are the types of things that we will work on throughout the school year, and this is important that you understand the difference between each of them. Thank you.